Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Freedom seems to continue to be more and more limited in a country like Britain. A Conservative MP says the British government will make it illegal to participate in the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions movement next year. Now, this basically means that, similar to many of their American cousins, Brits will not be free to choose to boycott the racist apartheid entity of Israel in the same way the global civil community was able to boycott and pressure the former apartheid regime in South Africa until it fell. What does it all mean for freedom of choice in countries which profess to believe in democracy but show themselves to be quite authoritarian, especially when it comes to Israel?
Alarm bells have rung across Britain after a Conservative MP informed pro-Israel activists of new government plans to outlaw the pro-Palestine boycott, divestment and sanctions movement. The comments were said by British lawmaker Robert Jenrick during an online conference about anti-Semitism titled "Why Do So Many People Hate Jews?"
It is, I think, becoming much more of a fringe activity. What we want to do is pass a piece of legislation here, and I'm pretty confident it will be in the next legislative programme, the Queen's Speech as we call it.
Since 2005, the boycott campaign, also known as BDS, has sought to sanction all Israeli-made products produced on illegally occupied Palestinian lands. The movement has been so successful in causing economic damage to Israel that pro-Israel groups have branded the BDS an existential threat and attempted to smear its supporters as anti-Semitic.
It's a shocking decision from the humanitarian point of view, where once again the British government is standing by the oppressor, is standing by the occupier, is standing by the criminal against the victim. It's something that it doesn't surprise, but it shocks us to the how tone deaf this government is. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that if anything, this government has stupidly, foolishly, ridiculously has actually afforded far more credit to BDS than it could ever have imagined.
This development would be just the latest example of a long line of attacks that this government has carried out against Palestine solidarity activism since it came into power. If they go ahead with these plans next year, then we can expect to see large-scale protest and condemnation action taking place from the many supporters of the Palestinian cause up and down the country. Robert Carter, Press TV, London.
I'd like to welcome my guests to the Spotlight. Journalist and political analyst Hafsa Kara Mustapha out of London. And lawyer and BDS campaigner Blaine Coleman out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. Well, welcome both of you to the program. I'd like to start off with Hafsa. I mean, the Conservative MP exposed plans by the government during an online conference that they would be making it illegal to participate in the BDS. I mean, what is your perspective about this if it really happens?
It's difficult to say. I don't think in practice it will impact the act of boycotting Israeli goods and events, because obviously people are entirely free to carry out those boycotts, and they are free to refuse to purchase goods that were produced illegally and in a country that violates human rights law and oppresses the Palestinian people. However, I think it's the act of promoting those boycotts that becomes illegal and therefore becomes problematic, because of course pro-Palestinian organizations are reliant on this technique, and in order first to promote the Palestinian cause and also to push for more rights of Palestinians through peaceful means. Now, of course, many of us have been saying that we shouldn't have been putting all our eggs in the same basket by concentrating exclusively on BDS, because of course resistance to Israeli oppression needs to take various forms. But of course for Palestinians, every single form of resistance is demonized, is turned into an illegal act, and even something as peaceful as boycotting Israeli goods, or rather goods made in occupied Palestine, becomes something demonized and becomes illegal. So I think it just reinforces the idea that there are many influential and powerful lobby groups that will act and will use any means possible to pressure and destroy the Palestinian resistance movement. But of course, on the plus side, everything that they do actually reveals the heinous and demonic aspect of Israeli policies and Israeli supporters.
Okay. Well, let me get Blaine in on this. Blaine, your perspective, I mean, you're sitting in the U.S. in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and of course we know that in the majority of U.S. states right now, there have been attempts to make, of course, participating in BDS illegal. How has it affected the BDS movement there, or has it affected it?
Well, Marcia, first of all, I'm really glad you're back in action. And second of all, yes, the BDS movement in the U.S., I believe, has not been affected by these silly laws. And as the other guest rightly mentioned, in the United Kingdom, I don't think the BDS movement is going to be seriously affected by these stupid laws either. And the reason is because, in my opinion, what counts with this BDS movement is having people marching on the ground in their city councils demanding action against Israel. And, you know, you don't have to demand boycott against Israel if for some reason they actually outlaw it, which I don't think they're going to do. But if they really do that, you can do what we do in our city council in Ann Arbor. I don't know if you can see the sign here.
Yes.
We hold this sign up at almost every city council meeting that we can get into that says we are against military aid to Israel. Now, how are you going to outlaw that? In the United States, it's impossible to outlaw that. In the Constitution, it says you can petition your government for the redress of grievances. And in the United Kingdom, I think similarly, they would not be able to outlaw someone going to the city council in London or Bristol or anywhere with a sign like this. It's impossible.
Okay.
So there's more than one way to skin a cat. You can demand boycott if it's legal. If somehow these idiots illegalize it, you can demand an end to military aid to Israel. Now in the UK, you can demand no more military equipment to Israel because the UK sends a lot of military equipment to Israel. So these stupid laws are not going to stop anything. The one thing that will stop the BDS movement is BDS activists who imprison themselves in social media and who won't get to their city councils, won't go to their student governments, and won't publicly demand action against Israel. That's the only thing that can stop the BDS movement.
Okay. Well, Hafsa, your take on this. I mean, in general, what does it say about a country who tries to make it illegal? Because according to Blaine and yourself, you don't think that they can be effective in actually stopping this movement. But the fact that, for example, the United States and the United Kingdom seem to be actively trying to stop this, participants in the BDS, I mean, what does it say about the countries themselves?
Well, I think it says that they're completely beholden to Israeli interests. But can I just pick up on a point raised by the other panelists? I would love to agree and say that it won't really have much impact, but I think it depends how the new laws are going to be worded. So if it's worded in the sense that it's a hate crime and it's racism, then in the UK, at the very least, there are risks for activists to be even imprisoned. Now, I think that the US laws actually on free speech are much more open, and I think that there is there's far greater freedom of speech in the US than in many European countries where, for instance, you have laws that literally you can be imprisoned if you question certain aspects of the Second World War, if you question certain things about various, even Armenian genocide in France, for instance, if you don't abide by what the French have agreed, then you can actually be imprisoned for up to 5 years. So it really depends on how the politicians will word their policies, and that is actually quite alarming, because if they make it out to be a hate crime, then there are risks for Palestinian activists to be imprisoned should they promote BDS. Having said that, of course, in answer to your question, I think it really does reveal that these countries are very much sliding towards dictatorships, and we don't really need the BDS to be aware of that. I think the imprisonment of somebody like Julian Assange, for example, is an example of how much freedom of expression, of how much democracy are eroded in these countries, who are lecturing other countries about things such as freedom of expression, such as human rights, and who actually on their soil are not applying it. We have seen that somebody like Julian Assange has literally been rotting away in prison for many, many years, simply for revealing and for doing his job as a journalist and as a whistleblower, and he's been imprisoned. So imagine somebody who supports the Palestinian cause can face something similar. And I think that what is happening is these laws are being introduced precisely to scare activists and to make sure that they abstain from supporting the Palestinian cause. Of course, the upside of that is that people are also now more and more aware of the nature of Israeli policies, and therefore they're waking up, and therefore they're resisting it. So I think it's a sort of balance, but I do think it's actually rather worrying, in particular in European countries and in the UK.
Right. Well, Blaine, isn't it interesting that countries like the United Kingdom and the United States, that a citizen is freer to criticize their own countries than they are to criticize Israel? This is quite mind-boggling. Your take on that, what exactly does that mean? Okay, we've lost Blaine. Hopefully we'll be able to, I have you, Blaine, go ahead.
Yeah, and I'm sure both of them.
Okay, it seems that we're having some problems with the connection. So I'll pose that same question to you, Hafsa, until hopefully we will establish that connection with Blaine. I mean, what do you make of it? It is rather bizarre that you can criticize your own country more and inside of that country than you can another entity.
Absolutely, and I think that we rightly saw, I think it was a Palestinian teacher who took the Texas to court because she wasn't allowed to practice the BDS. And so in the US, it's very bizarre that you can criticize your president, your government, various authorities, but it's considered illegal and hate crime or racism or whatever it is that the lawmaker seems to have come up with regarding Israel. And I think it really reveals what Donald Trump has said just last week in a recent interview, that actually Israel controls the US Congress. Now, what happens is that because Israeli lobbyists actually can pay a US congressman to be at their service, they have invested enough money to buy themselves each a US congressman, and therefore what this resulted in is it is the Israeli government that actually controls the American powerful authority, which is the Congress. So in essence, through their money, they have these congressmen who, rather than work towards the benefit of the American people, for the American people, introducing laws that benefit the American people, they're actually working solely to benefit Israel and the Israeli government. And this is why, for instance, they will hesitate in introducing laws to provide decent health care, free education, and all those things that other governments take for granted. However, they will always vote in favor for large sums of money being devoted to the Israeli government and the Israeli war machine. And this is something that is very astonishing for many people outside who cannot understand how they vote for politicians who are more committed and more devoted to a foreign entity than to their very own people and population.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting what you've just said, Hafsa, because it would appear, I mean, when we're talking about, even talking about the possibility of this taking place in the UK next year, I would think that British citizens should be outraged at the possibility of although you said it's not going to have an effect, but even that the government would think that they could do this, which of course they have done or tried to do in many American states. Do you think that we would see some type of blowback from the British people in general? Because it's not really just talking about here the Palestinian cause of BDS, it's also the weeding away of their individual rights.
I think it's difficult because the UK culturally has a very apathetic population that very rarely takes to the street and imposes its will on governing authorities. It's been sort of conditioned to accept the rule of law and authority and very rarely question it. Remember, this is a monarchy, this isn't a republic, and it doesn't function in the way many old democracies function, whereby people take to the street to ask for their rights. They are literally conditioned to accept what the politicians often tell them, and it's very rare, in fact, to see mass protests in the streets. And sadly, when you do see protests in the UK, they're often very demonized in the mainstream media, essentially, which is dominated by a right-wing press that considers that any street protest is some sort of savagery and is uncivilized behavior. And even when they do protest in large numbers, in any case, the authorities, for instance, completely ignore. So you'll have one major example, which I think many Britons who are listening tonight will remember, was the opposition to Iraq in 2000, literally taking that war. Now, the only thing that Tony Blair did was appreciate that it was an expression of freedom of expression, of course, but in essence, it had absolutely no impact because it didn't change his mind, it didn't change his policy, despite the consequences and despite the opposition to that conflict. So, is that people seeing that their protests do not result in any meaningful action have literally simply abstained from reacting to any of these policies. And it's very sad. And of course, because there is a social condition that has been deteriorated, for instance, you're seeing the NHS, that the health service that isn't very well funded, you have schooling that is deteriorating, you have transport that is deteriorating, you have people that have far more pressing issues rather than actually take to the streets to require more rights.
Okay, stay with me, Hafsa. Blaine, hopefully we have a better connection. Can you hear me, Blaine?
Yes, Marzia, perfectly.
Okay, great. Blaine, I mean, on a regular basis, when we look at what's happening to the Palestinians being killed by the Israeli regime or being maimed or neighborhoods being taken over, their homes being bulldozed, crippling siege, of course, on Gaza. I mean, with all of this being said and everything that is happening, we always see that this is downplayed already in the corporate media, mainstream media. And now we see these governments trying to actually coerce their own citizens basically to keep quiet, not to say anything. I mean, this seems like a total different level of going towards authoritarianism. I mean, I want your perspective on the direction that these so-called liberal democracies or countries are going into.
Well, Marzia, I guess I don't have too much time to complain about them. You and I have seen this for many years when it comes to Israel. And again, like I say, there's nothing to stop us from talking. Now, there is a good side to this attempted repression by the U.S. The good side is it's having an impact. As it is, BDS has made enough noise to have, and the Zionists are afraid. That's a good thing. Is that all the screaming and yelling against BDS by the UK government.
Okay, we've totally lost Ann Arbor and Blaine, unfortunately. Well, Hafsa, he was talking about that he thinks that it is having an impact, though. He made an interesting point that actually when the Zionists are making so much noise and there's so much attention and they're attempting to silence anyone or an entity, it does say something that it has them running scared and it's having an impact. Your take on all of this, the impact that you think that BDS has had on affecting the Israeli regime, and what needs to happen from here?
I I would agree. I have to say that, if this didn't have any impact, or if this didn't affect Israel in any way, then they wouldn't be investing so much effort in going after it, in lobbying so many governments to legislate against it. So there's clearly an effect. I don't think it's impacting, in essence, the Israeli economy as such, but I think it is having an effect on public that for many they've been fed a certain narrative on the Palestinians and on the Palestinian resistance movement, and they're now do something as very and peaceful as refusing to buy goods is being demonized. That is having an effect on public opinion, which realizes that in fact the baddies in this story are the Israelis, because of course for almost 50-60 years many people had been believed that the baddies were in fact the Palestinians, who were only resisting the occupation of their land. But now, because of all these efforts, so bizarrely it's self-destructive for Israel in the long run, because they're showing their real faces and they're showing the nature of the Israeli by going after the most peaceful and the most innocuous form of resistance and of policy making. So I think that, yes, this has a very positive impact on the long run. Sadly, in the short run, it's going, because it's going to deter many from embracing the Palestinian cause. It's going to scare many people away. But on the other hand, it will reveal the Israeli policy's actual nature. And I think that slowly but surely will actually start eroding the influence on Western governments and Western policymakers.
And on that note, I'd like to thank you, Hafsa Kara Mustapha, journalist and political analyst out of London, also lawyer and BDS campaigner Blaine Coleman out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. And my apologies, viewers, for some technical difficulties during this spotlight, but we appreciate you all being with us. And make sure you join us right here, same place tomorrow for another spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi, signing out for all the crew right here in Tehran. See you next time. Goodbye.